Thank you so much, Chris. Welcome everyone to our session today. We're going to be talking about productivity and innovation in the future, and we've got 4 wonderful speakers. I'd like to acknowledge I'm speaking from Corner Country, and just a reminder, each presentation is about 15 minutes, so if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll have a Q&A session after everyone has spoken. All right, our first speaker today is Professor John Quiggin. John is a Vice-Chancellor's Senior Fellow in Economics at the University of Queensland. He's a prominent research economist and he's a commentator on many Australian and international economic policy issues. He's produced over 2,000 publications in many diverse fields, including decision theory, environmental economics, and industrial organisation. So please welcome John.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Yes, I'm speaking from Jaguar and Terrible Country in Brisbane, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So the topic I've been given is how is the labour market changing and how does it need to change? And what I mostly want to talk about is the implications of an information economy for the labour market and the way it works. And the experience of the pandemic has both dramatised and accelerated the transformation of work from producing goods and services to managing, exchanging and distributing information, what I'm doing right now. That process has been going on for a long time, really since the late 20th century, but still our mental categories haven't caught up with it. We're mostly, in crucial respects, 1 or 2 transformations back. So even though the idea of a post-industrial economy has been around for a long time, there's still a lot of our public discussion is about the industrial economy. And even when we think of services, we have yet really to take account of the way in which services have gone from being, in some sense, ancillary to an industrial economy to being the main game in what most people actually do. So I think the first we've seen going back to the 1980s and 1990s, people like Alvin Toffler and Barry Jones in his Sleeper's Wake talking about these kinds of developments, most notably Reich in his discussion of a symbolic analyst was perhaps the first person to really get a handle on that. So nonetheless, most discussion still focuses on the notion of the industrial economy, which reached its peak in the mid-21st century. Those of us who are of that age will remember the distinction between primary, secondary and tertiary economic activity, and that's reflected in the main focus of GDP and national accounting. The central idea there is to focus on value added in each sector. So we begin with an economy whose purpose is to take natural resources, food and agriculture, convert them into manufactured goods, distribute those manufactured goods to the public and through wholesale and retail trade, then provide some backup services like finance. And obviously, as the pandemic's shown, that part of the economy is still alive and important, and it's had a major set of disruptions associated with the pandemic. But what we've also seen in the context is an entirely separate sector of the economy going on almost without a beat, despite the massive disruption caused by the pandemic. And so the experience of the pandemic has been radically different depending on which of these parts of the economy you're located in. So stepping back to the bigger picture, we've seen a variety of periodisations of economic systems, starting with the rise of agriculture a few thousand years ago. Before that, of course, we don't really know what the hunter-gatherer societies that preceded agriculture were like, since not many of them, they didn't leave written records, and most of them, as in Australia, suffered catastrophic impacts as soon as they encountered agriculture. The societies that actually became agricultural we know only little about. But the more interesting, the next big development was the rise of industrial society, starting in England and northeastern Europe in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and reaching its peak, as I've said, in the developed world in the mid 20th century. And one of the, indeed, I think at least some of the buildings near the Academy, one of them is named after Heinz Arndt. His 1960 book on the Australian economy was called A Small, Rich Industrial Economy. And the point of this title was deliberately provocative to challenge a notion of Australia as an agricultural society riding on the sheep's back at large, pointing out that really Australians lived and worked in cities and were engaged one way or another in the industrial economy. So even as he wrote, though, that economy had reached its peak. The peak of manufacturing employment was in the mid-20th century. We saw the rise of services, and increasingly the rise of services which didn't fit into this industrial economy. So that model had no problem with transport, with retail and wholesale trade, but activities like health and education were stuck off to one side. And we said there's still in our national accounts. There's nothing in the national accounts about what the education and health sectors actually do. All we have is we've got a bunch of people working in these sectors and their activity is imputed to whatever it is that costs. So that service sector is really not accounted for in the national account, and still, as I say, not accounted for in the thinking of our political leaders. We still have a huge amount of nostalgia for an Australia that makes things, as opposed to an Australia that does things and provides services. And that nostalgia drives policy, usually in unhelpful ways, and is now 2 steps behind the times, because we've seen the rise of the service sector to the point where it employs nearly everybody, about 80% of the economy. We've still got it in this undifferentiated lump, but in the process of development, the service sector itself now has to be subdivided into personally delivered services, the kind that became particularly problematic during the pandemic, things like hospitality, healthcare, education, all ran into difficulties as opposed to information services. And part of the process of the pandemic was shifting activities which had previously been delivered in person into the information sector. So what are the implications of all of this for labour markets? Well, again, we have labour market institutions, to the extent we have them, largely inherited from industrial economies. So Marx was really, I think, the first person to see what was going on in the industrial economy. But what we saw was the rise of large-scale factory employment, which brought together large numbers of workers under conditions in which they naturally saw themselves as having common interests and where they had the capacity to organise. Meanwhile, with under the eye of owners for whom the factory was a method of supervision and control, displacing earlier systems like putting out and so forth, where, for example, textiles were sent to people's cottages, they worked on them in the cottage and delivered them in a piecework system. So we had in this industrial area, industrial disputes, industrial organisation, all these kinds of concepts have as their starting point the notion that we have workers gathered together in large groups, more or less doing more or less similar work, and then having both shared and conflicting interests with their employers. So obviously, workers and employers both want the industry to do well, but they are in dispute over how the proceeds of that industry should be developed. And so, in this more rich industrial economy that Bart was writing about, the great majority of workers belonged to trade unions. The people who didn't, indeed, were people up in the services sector. It was only well into this period that the arbitration court, as then was, decided that things like education and health could be called industries. And so workers in these sectors were late to industrialise. They're now, of course, largely in the public sector for last groups with high levels of unionisation. The rise of the service sector coincided globally with a decline in unionism and decline in the bargaining power of workers, and that was a combination of changes in the mode of organisation, simply that workers became more dispersed, more heterogeneous, less capable of organising. At the same time, one particular industry, the finance sector, became immensely powerful and used that power to promote the interests of capital against the interests of labour, so that we've seen throughout the world, but particularly in the English-speaking countries, a decline in the wage share of national income, an increase in the inequality of wage income, a weakening of trade unions. So the question arises, what's going to happen with the information economy? And the striking development of the pandemic was, of course, there'd been this long discussion about working from home and so forth. The pandemic forced us to test this out under the most unfavourable possible conditions. That is, we didn't have all the preparation and consultation that we're supposed to have. We went home from work one Friday. By next Monday, we were told, stay home, do your work from home. By the way, the kids will be there too. You'll have to deal with them. Or I think even the most optimistic advocates of work from home would have expected massive disruptions in and loss of productivity in the process of adjustment, whereas in fact this was almost undetectable. I mean, have the issue of what happened to kids' schooling, I guess, is a separate one, but certainly one way or another, the schooling got done at the same time. At the same time, the work of information workers continued almost without a beat. The time saved in commuting was soaked up in domestic tasks and in setting things up, but there was almost no effect. And so this suggests that this mode of organisation is going to continue substantially into the future, and we're already seeing it in events like this. That this event, of course, probably some events like this will return to being held in person, but increasingly, especially for lower key sorts of things, it's much easier to say, let's have a little workshop by Zoom rather than saying, let's find a spot somewhere in the world where we can all get together and then do that. And at the same time, working from home in ordinary work has become a desired feature for many workers. So we see, of course, pushback from that, for example, from people in the CBD who want people to come into the CBD, but there's no obvious reason why labour market organisations should be devoted to promoting the interests of one particular region. So what we see in this context is a breakdown of a whole bunch of assumptions. So first, the idea that workers, to be productive, need to be under the immediate supervision of the boss. That seems to be much more problematic. But of course, this is going to be it already is a site of a new kind of conflict. If you're working from home, to what extent does your employer have the right to control what you're doing, have two-way vision of what's happening in your home office or perhaps in your kitchen? To what extent are they going to say, look, as long as you deliver the work at the end of the day, it doesn't matter to me whether you stopped to make your lunch in the middle or stopped to vacuum the floor or whatever you might have chosen to do. And so this conflict is clearly emerging, and my perception is that for most employers, the costs of engaging in close supervision exceed the benefits. That is, it's obviously costly in the sense that workers don't like it. It's hard to make effective, even in contexts like call centres, which can be pretty tightly monitored. My impression is that home work from call centres home call centre work has proved more satisfactory and less directly controlled than the physical call centres, which it's largely replacing. So that's sort of one aspect. That, assuming that there are productivity gains, which I think there clearly will be, how will those productivity gains be divided up? And we have yet really to see this. It's clear in some sense the bargaining power of workers has increased because local labour market monopolies are being disrupted. That is, it's much more difficult for an employer to say, well, I'm the only employer of this kind in your region, so you have to accept what I do, and you have to sign this non-compete agreement. It's much easier for the worker to say, well, that's fine, but I'll just sign up with an employer in another state who doesn't care about me not being there. So my view is the likelihood is that some of the losses to workers arising from the shift to a personal service economy will be reversed in the information economy, at least for that group of workers. Then the question remains, well, what happens to the 50 or so % of workers who are in the old goods economy or in the personal services economy? Do they benefit from this, or do they become a residual category? So I think I've used my time, so I'll stop right there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. Okay, our second speaker today is Professor Marion Bart, who is the Professor of Gender and Employment Relations. She became that in 2009, making her the first female professor in industrial relations at the University of Sydney. She's a presiding Chancellor at the University of Sydney as well. Marion is one of Australia's leading researchers in the field of women, work and care. So please welcome Marion.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Sarah. And before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge country, and I'll do that by sharing my screen. Has that shared?
No, your screen hasn't shared.
Yeah, no, I'm fixing it now.
Yep.
That's working?
Yes.
Yes.
Just present. Yep.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Look, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Camaragal land, which is just north of Port Jackson or Sydney Harbour in Sydney. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to say that it's an absolute delight and honour to be here at the ASA 50th Anniversary Symposium. Pity that we're not in Canberra, but having the experience of doing it by Zoom, as John has outlined, may make us more productive, though there are times when I doubt that, especially in the education sphere, and that's something I will come to as well. So, John, we might have a little bit of a discussion, I hope, because one of the directions we were given was to be a bit provocative. So I'm hoping that my presentation does that as well. I've called my presentation to produce or reproduce. Is that the question for women when we consider the future of work and the future of Australia? So in this presentation, I want to focus on work and care, or production and reproduction, and both are essential if Australia is to be a productive society in the full meaning of the word. And that focus necessarily draws me to the position of women in Australia today. They face a number of work and care tensions, and Australia as a society faces a number of critical gender-related work and care problems, and many of you will be familiar with them through the press at least. These tensions have been building for some time, but have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 health economic crisis. And I think that's a really critical point, that COVID is not just a change in the way we work and use our economy. It was also a health crisis, which gave states around the world much more authority to intervene than usual. And it may have brought the state back into our policy thinking, and that may be a good benefit of COVID. So what are the problems as I see them? And of course, you know, there could be a huge list of problems, but I've tried to condense them to 4 that I think are interrelated and really go to this question of production and reproduction. Low fertility rates, ageing population, women's withdrawal from the labour market, and lack of respect. And I'll just go through those briefly. First, fertility rates are predicted to be low and below replacement rate. The predicted fertility rate is expected to be around 1.6, and some later predictions are suggesting even lower. That's definitely not replacing our population. It also limits, importantly, the growth in the size of our workforce, which is already under pressure, and that latter problem has been compounded by the barriers to immigration at the moment. Second, Australia, like many high-income countries, has an ageing population, resulting in high and growing care demands. And this relates back actually to this morning's session on the health system in Australia as well. With an ageing population, demand for elder care and care of those who are frail or with a disability will continue to increase, setting the scene for increased work and care clashes, mainly for women. Third, women are withdrawing from the labour market. After decades of growth, women's participation is now falling, probably driven mostly by COVID-19. It's not yet clear what will happen in the recovery, except we know from previous research on pandemics and recessions that women's economic security and well-being is more negatively affected than men's, and often takes from 3 to 7 years to get back to where it was pre-crisis. In seasonally adjusted terms, in August 2021, that's this year, the participation rate for women decreased from 61.9% in March to 60% in September, a decrease of about 2%, and back to August 2017 rates. This drop indicates to me, and of course, labour economists, we will have to investigate this further, but it indicates a disaffected, even distressed reaction from women and the potential for a long negative COVID impact. We hypothesise that women's exit from the paid labour market is due to the extra pressures brought on with the responsibility for schooling at home during COVID-19, leading women to reconsider how to combine family responsibility with paid work, especially if that work is not in itself in good or decent jobs. This could have longer terms and likely to have longer term negative labour market consequences for these women. And I'd say that just to sort of elaborate a bit further on John's hypothesis that productivity has not declined, I think if we took a lens of a gender lens to it, we may see some different patterns. In recent research we did in Australian universities, for example, we found that during COVID-19, female academics more than male academics have withdrawn labour effort from particular parts of their job, especially grant application writing and article preparation. And of course, while that may be a short-term response, it will have implications for longer-term career success. And fourth, for some time, we've seen a major lack of respect for women in the workplace and the community. Research we undertook in 2018 and 2019 of young Australian working women showed that respect was what women wanted most at work, and it aligned directly with pay and reward. The Respect at Work report of the Sex Discrimination Commissioner told the same story, as do the many, and actually too many, recent reports and incidents of sexual harassment, discrimination, and even violence at work and in the community. This lack of respect is coupled with a range of other workplace inequalities. Despite many years of education and Australian women being amongst the highest qualified in the world, they experience unequal treatment at work. There is an ongoing and persistent pay gap, a working hours gap, career and leadership gaps, superannuation gaps, and as well as I've just mentioned, harassment and discrimination being characteristic of far too many workplaces. Arguably, the COVID-19 crisis exacerbated all these problems. And this leads me to say that, to take this a step further, to say that the gender contract at work and in Australia is badly damaged, if not broken, and we need to repair it. This is where the social sciences really can contribute. Why is it important to think about our gender contract? And I say this is because, as Carol Pateman said many years ago, we live in an employment society, and perhaps increasingly so, where work is the marker of our citizenship and from which many economic and social benefits flow. Work today, however, is not defined by regular or secure employment. Platform or gig work is growing and insecure. Casualised work is widespread and more so for women than men. Before COVID hit, 24% of the total workforce were casual, and more than a quarter of women, 27%, were in jobs that did not provide paid leaves, the ABS's, if you like, definition of casual employment. The gender contract at work is critical because work is so central to our lives and our economy and our social relationships. In academic terms, the gender contract is the systematic ordering of relations between women and men as a gender system that is constructed, controlled, and reinforced by a gender-based power structure. But in other words, the gender contract refers to how we as a society understand the rules of the game between men and women, and for our purposes today, what we expect of women and men in terms of paid work and unpaid care. In Australian workplaces today, we also have to broaden our understanding of the gender contract to be inclusive of not just cisgender men and women, but all people across the sex and gender spectrums, including those in the transgender, gender diverse, non-binary community. And as research in Sweden has shown, the gender contract does vary by geographic location. And if we bring in our intersectional understandings, we know that the contract will also vary by class, race, and age. So I do think we need to ask ourselves these questions. What are the expectations between women and men and of women and men, and between cisgender and gender diverse people in Australia? Can women be both active economic producers and biological reproducers? How can women be involved in the labour market and also socially reproduce by providing care for others if our institutions, our policies, and our gender contract don't support them? The question to do paid work or not, to have or delay having babies or not, while highlighted in COVID, is not just a question that has come about in COVID times. In research we undertook that I mentioned earlier of 16 to 40-year-olds, we found that the question of having children was preoccupying the minds of young women prior to COVID. Our research found that shared domestic labour was desired increasingly by young men and women, and there was a convergence between the expectations of young men and women with children about parenting and the essential role that a supportive work and care policy context plays in the future of work and family formation for them. Others have also found that attitudes to fatherhood are changing, and this is also reflected in some workplaces and quite leading enterprises who are encouraging men, for example, to take their paid parental leave. But in the absence of supportive policies across the country, young women calculate the cost of combining children with work and say that is too high, leaving their ability to work, form families, and provide care at risk. In the current context, our data suggests that for many young women, having a career or maintaining their jobs in the labour market will trump having a child, and especially will trump having more children or more than one child. And that led us to speculate just 2 to 3 years ago that the one-child family was fast approaching in Australia. The demographic trends seem to be confirming this. So what can be done in policy terms to assist Australia's young women and men, our future workforce, our future generation? I turn to 3 policies that we're all very familiar with, but do need serious attention and change: paid parental leave, care policy, and flexible work policy. I also want to add a new policy that's really quickly emerging onto the policy agenda, and I'm calling it reproductive leave policy. But let's look at the parental leave scheme in Australia very quickly. We do have paid parental leave and something called dad and partner pay. They're relatively major and recent pieces of social policy introduced just 10 years ago. But 10 years after the introduction of Australia's first paid parental leave scheme, we see that there's some success in its application, but considerable room for improvement. Use of the scheme is highly gendered, and fathers' use of parental leave is negligible. There are multiple factors influencing this gendered split, but changes to the architecture and administration of the scheme could promote higher take-up by fathers and therefore greater involvement in ongoing parenting by men. Some employers, though I note that 50% do not offer any paid parental leave, are moving in these directions already, but notably in those sectors with higher profits and higher skilled workers. They're providing longer paid leaves at replacement wage levels with superannuation and not distinguishing between mothers and fathers, or what have come to be called primary and secondary carers. These sorts of policies may aid in reshaping the gender contract at work and therefore at home by enabling both parents to care and not career punishing women for taking the leave. Second, we need an integrated life cycle approach to care policy. And here I'm not only referring to childcare, but also time to care for self, elders, and others. Again, this is not a new problem, but the COVID pandemic accentuated the childcare dilemma in Australia, as well as the crisis in paid leave to care for self or others. The childcare system, as we know, is marked by cost, complexity, and rigidity, and COVID briefly demonstrated that we could do it differently. We seriously need to overhaul the system in Australia. COVID also uncovered the lack of paid leave many workers have to care for themselves, to get vaccinated, or to be in quarantine, or to do the same for others. Paid sick leave is not available to those in casual positions, and as I said earlier, more than 1/4 of our workforce is employed casually. Additionally, COVID demonstrated the necessity of having a quality care workforce, but they themselves are underpaid, undervalued, and often in precarious and multiple jobs. This puts extra strains on the system as well as themselves. Working time flexibility. Now, we already know that we've needed this before, but again, COVID pushed flexibility up the policy agenda. While a formal right to request flexible work exists in our national employment standards, we need a stronger enforceable right and a more embracing right. We need to acknowledge that flexible work is not for just the parents with young children. The elder care crisis in institutional settings and in terms of the intensity of informal, unpaid care provided often, but not solely by women, who themselves are mature workers in our workforce, is putting the care system at breaking point. These women are often also providing grandparental care. So each of those three policies need to be improved upon. That's parental leave, care policy, and flexibility. And we need a seamless integration of the three of them. If we did that, this would enable and promote different working behaviours and presumably shift our gender contract. But there is another policy I want to bring to your attention, and I mentioned this before. It's reproductive leave. So while the above policies, the parental leave, care, and flexibility policies are focused on combining work, family, and care, there's actually a rapidly emerging policy debate around the world about the reproductive body itself. And as noted in the outset of my presentation today, there is a growing concern about Australia's declining fertility rate. Australia is not alone with this problem, but it has been exacerbated here as migration flows have been halted, and they are traditionally a source of population growth as well as skilled labour supply. Acknowledging the stresses and demands on the human body, there have been some recent noteworthy moves to assist women and men in reproduction, sexual health, and wellness. In one example that we're tracing at the moment, or tracking the actual progress of this in the Victorian mental health sector, these concerns were encapsulated in a claim in 2020 for reproductive leave by the Health and Community Services Union. This claim was across a range of areas from menstrual leave to stillbirth, pregnancy loss, fertility treatments, vasectomies, and gender transitioning. In the private sector this year, Spotify, for example, introduced a family forming policy. This policy allows every employee in the company access to a lifetime allowance to use for IVF, donor services, adoption, fertility preservation, or fertility assessments and education. There are a number of other policies, there are a number of other companies in Australia and in other countries introducing similar policies. These policies demonstrate the increasing entanglement of work and personal life They bring the body back into the workplace and into workplace debates, and they pay attention to biological reproduction as well as social reproduction. Both are needed to assist in economic production. How well accepted will these claims be? Initially, they may cause some surprise or alarm, especially amongst an older group of feminists. But it is interesting to observe how quickly conversation around menopause and menstrual leave has changed and taken off around the world. And indeed, our own chief scientist, Kathy Foley, who spoke yesterday, was calling for menopause leave recently. Australian women are central to the future of work and productivity. As policymakers in Australia and globally are advocating, we need to keep women and men in the workforce. Women are also central to the biological and social reproduction of our communities. Without policies that enable women to work, care, and reproduce, Australia will be a smaller and poorer nation. I think we must take the opportunity of COVID to reconfigure our gender contract, enabling and empowering women, men, and all genders to be productive citizens. The COVID-19 experience globally and the subsequent recession is testament also to the need for more engagement from social scientists so that they provide the evidence for policy change. COVID-19 focused our minds on the direct connection between care work and work, usually undertaken by women, and the economy. Let us not forget that connection. My hope for Australian women is that the question I have posed for my presentation, do women have to produce or reproduce, and is it a binary choice, can be reset, that we can reset the gender contract, that our policy and institutional frameworks will enable women not to have to make the either or choice, and that all of our policies will be underpinned with a policy of respect for the position and interests of everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marion. You raised many issues that are highly relevant for a lot of us females and indeed males listening to this talk today. All right, so our next speaker is another fantastic female. Sarah Pink is a design anthropologist, and she's focused primarily on questions relating to possible futures and emerging technologies using an interdisciplinary, international and interventional research agenda. She's also known internationally as a methodological innovator. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and I'm delighted to be here today, and I want to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land I'm presenting from today, and to pay my respect to their elders past and present. Now, in 2020, just before the COVID-19 pandemic, what now seems like a quite distant life, my colleagues and I, a team of design anthropologists, sociologists and technology experts, flew to rural New South Wales from Melbourne to meet 34 seniors who'd agreed to participate in a smart home technology trial led for a not-for-profit healthcare provider. Now, this Australian study was the first interdisciplinary project of its kind to investigate how these smart home technologies could best support seniors' wellbeing and independence. In the Emerging Technologies Lab, which I founded at Monash University 3 years ago, we're committed to publishing top quality scholarship, but we also write industry-focused reports, we make documentary films, and we do this because our agenda is to change the narrative and to establish the place of the social sciences in steering how emerging technologies become part of Australian society. Now, in the spirit of being provocative, this is one of my aims, but also this is in the spirit of generating new collaboration and direction. So I don't believe in trying to push arguments up against each other, but trying to bring things together. Now, the trailer for our Smart Homes for Seniors documentary sums up some of the work that we do. And I just want to screen share with you for a minute to show you the trailer from the film.
Do you always say please when you talk to Google?
I do. It's
Yes.
only habit.
Really fit into older people's lives?
It's a bit daunting, For someone of my age, when you've got all this new technology I haven't been brought up with.
This film joins a group of older people on their 6-month journey of living with smart home technologies in 2020. Our research team met with them in their homes in regional Australia.
You do need bright lighting in your bathroom at our age, because you can't afford to have anything on the floor because you're easily tripped over.
Going everywhere, it's not knocking out anywhere, you know. One day I said, hey Google, turn the kettle, turn the jug on.
Nothing happened.
Yes.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Edna and Bob, Hilda and Owen, Beryl and David, Robert, Helen and Ken, John and Shirley showed us where smart home technologies brought new value and joy into their lives, where they became frustrated with them, where they needed support, and when they were concerned about the cost of internet access, electricity, and technologies. If they're accompanied by the right social values, ethics, usability interfaces, and services, smart technologies can support older generations to stay safe, independent, and actively participating as our world rapidly changes.
So this is what we do. We get into people's real lives with them. And in our research with seniors, we use qualitative social science, empirical and theoretical research and analysis to understand seniors' real needs and to create new insights about the benefits of smart home technologies and the human services needed to support them. Now, put that way, the benefits that can be derived from smart home tech might sound obvious, but actually the impact and societal benefits of emerging technologies are very frequently expressed very differently. Now, every year, the consultancies, the technology journalists, and prominent engineers issue reports, podcasts, and news items where they predict top 10 emerging technologies that they believe will impact society and business in the coming year. Examples include the annual MIT Technology Review's 10 breakthrough technologies, Scientific American's top 10 emerging technologies, and the consultancy group McKinsey & Co.'s top tech trends. Now, over the years, the claims changed. So about 5 years ago, their predictions tended to focus on automated, intelligent and connected technologies like self-driving cars, digital voice assistants, or AI-driven medical devices. At the moment, they've shifted to focus mainly on automated systems, on modes of connectivity and intelligent materials. So what's happened is there's been a move from predicting that automated devices will change our future lives towards instead envisaging how automated systems will change society, but optimizing elements of business and government and even optimizing life itself. Now, whatever the scale of the technologies that are discussed in these reports, their predictions are usually based on one, for me anyway, for social scientists, I think, one common misconception. They believe that technological advances driven by investment in science and engineering research and infrastructure will drive beneficial change. So they naively, I think, but confidently assume that technological discovery and invention will solve society's problems. And this narrative assumes that societal change follows a causal process whereby heroic technological engineering feats or inventions promise to benefit society and individual lives. Now, this approach also depends on the view that to achieve their promise of social change, technologies just need to be properly regulated. They need to be made in a way that's ethical. And it's thought that this will actually then lead people leading ordinary everyday lives to then trust the technologies and to accept them and subsequently get the benefits. Now, the idea that technology drives societal change, as I hope all good social scientists know, is contrary to the theoretical and empirical evidence that's provided by decades of anthropological and sociological research. And this is research about how people perceive, how people experience, and how people use technologies in everyday life. So while retrospectively, it might look as if a technology has created change, this actually rarely happens. For instance, if we take a technology that most of us will have used, it might appear that the introduction of the smartphone has changed the way people live and the way people communicate. But studies of how people actually use their smartphones in specific circumstances actually show that the device itself did not bring about the change. Instead, change happens as people use the possibilities offered by the smartphone to achieve their everyday priorities. Now, with smart home tech then as well, as the Smart Home for Seniors documentary trailer shows us, people shape their own uses of technology with the help of other people, and they do so in relation to their diverse needs and at different life stages. So for me, as an anthropologist of emerging technologies, it's actually quite alarming that the opinion that technologies that are tamed by regulatory frameworks can actually shape society and can improve people's lives. And it's really, for me, alarming that this view is so influential still in government and policy circles. It also amazes me that the views of engineers and accountancy firms, by which I mean the consultancies, are so often taken more seriously than the views of anthropologists and sociologists, who are actually experts in how new technologies become part of real people's lives. At best, sometimes community consultations or co-design activities are proposed as ways of accessing public opinion, but neither consultation nor co-design are actually analytical practices. They don't bring the deep knowledge of society and people that the social sciences specialise in. So I see that there's a glaring missed opportunity for government and policy actors to engage the world-leading expertise of social scientists to guide the effective, ethical and responsible policies that are actually appropriate to Australia and to Australians. So what are the implications then of missing the opportunity to involve anthropologists and sociologists in planning for Australia's technology futures? Well, I think one of the main issues, and the one I focus on here, there are others of course, is that it could lead to designs of technologies that seek to solve problems that do not necessarily exist. And the example of the future of transport mobilities is a really good example of this. Now, autonomous driving vehicles, or ADVs, include self-driving cars, self-driving shuttles, buses, and trucks. Now, these usually have they're classified as internationally as having 5 different levels of autonomy, ranging from autonomous features that support and assist drivers to full autonomy where the driver isn't needed at all. Now, in 2015, self-driving cars were the most hyped emerging technology, and they were envisaged to be fully autonomous and on the roads by 2020. Obviously, that didn't happen. In 2017, an Australian government report, based on surveys and expert consultation, recommended that to enable the acceptance of ADVs amongst Australians and to gain their safety and their other benefits, there should be greater public engagement and testing of ADVs in situations where the public might experience them. But by 2021, ADVs haven't delivered their promise. They're far from being on our roads. But there's certainly still enthusiasm for ADVs. The Australian Trade and Investment Commission currently notes on their website that strong government support exists at all levels for intelligent transport systems and emerging technologies in automated vehicles. On its website, the Australian Government Department for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communication presents a series of future scenarios where ADVs solve for transport challenges of diverse personas, and I emphasise personas, not people, because personas are imaginary, often aggregated models of future people, which tend to be created by design agencies or by consultants. Now, this means there's a big gap in knowledge. We don't actually know how or if a diverse Australian population with a strong car ownership culture would actually participate in these scenarios, because personas are not actually real Australians. Now let's compare this then with what's happening in Sweden. I thought it was interesting that Marion mentioned Sweden as well. It's kind of a key reference point, I think, in many respects, because Sweden is a very different context. Also, though, because it's the home to a leading automotive company. But also because in Sweden, Drive Sweden, which is one of the Swedish government's strategic innovation programs, has what's called an engagement theme. And Drive Sweden's engagement theme emphasises, and I quote, that the public needs to be part of the process of creating new mobility solutions through user-involving innovation methods. Now, very significantly then, it states that this needs to happen by using, and I quote again, because the language is so important, by using everyday life experiences as starting points for creating realistic solutions and opportunities. Now, this means the experiences of real people, not personas. Drive Sweden has funded 2 groundbreaking future automated mobility projects, which I participate in. They're both subtitled A Human Approach. And these projects are driven by the theory and the practice of design anthropology. And they involve interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder teams from universities, from Volvo Cars, and from 2 key Swedish cities. They use a living lab model where social science research brings real-life experiences of everyday existing, simulated and imagined future ADV experiences into dialogues with our stakeholders. Our team gets into their everyday lives of people, just as we did in the Smart Homes for Seniors film. And we get into people's real lives as they experience, experiment, and actually dream with and about ADVs. We ask how the technologies might really be useful to people and what the implications of this might be for city planners and for the future of the automotive and service industries. Now, one example, which I think is a good example, is our work on what's called the first and last mile problem. And some people might have heard of this, but briefly, the first and last miles actually refer to people's travel between the home, the railway station or the bus station, and work, those bits of their commutes that aren't already covered by public transport. Now, consultancies and the industry often present these journey segments as a problem because it's believed that people unnecessarily use their own cars to cover these journey segments. And it's assumed then that the problem could be solved by providing ADV shuttles for people to catch. But in our research in Sweden, we found that for many people, this short journey segment is not a problem that could be solved with an autonomous driving shuttle for many reasons about how you transport people and things in the morning and at night. But also we found that for many other people, it's not even a problem at all because they like to walk or to cycle or to socialise during that part of their trip. Now, going back to the Australian Department for Infrastructure, Transport, Region Development and Communications website, there, the first mile problem is solved by a scenario for one of their personas. But the Swedish example really makes me think that before investing any funding in engineering research or in infrastructure, in order to create the solution to this problem, shouldn't we actually be engaging with social science research to ask if in Australia, these are really the problems and solutions that we need to confront? Because the evidence is that perhaps in Sweden they aren't. Now, there are some excellent future transport mobilities initiatives in Australia, such as the Australia and New Zealand Driverless Vehicle Initiative and the iMove CRC, but we still lack a coherent interdisciplinary research agenda for future automated mobilities. ADVs are being tested in Australia. They're being tested in places including Australian university campuses, in parks and on test sites, but they're being tested in the absence of Australia's world-leading social scientists. In Sweden, my colleagues and I have been funded by government innovation initiatives to work closely with AD car tests to understand how people's experience of simulated AD cars, which are called Wizardors cars, actually what that experience is. I was awarded a 6-month Swedish Knowledge Foundation professorship to build our design ethnographic research approach. In Australia, I think in contrast, the opportunity to draw on the expertise of the social sciences is being missed. There are ambitions to get ADVs on the roads in Australia. There are new Australian automotive software and digital and service industries and startups which are emerging. Now, for me as a social scientist, it seems crucial to it that we need to ensure that all of these ambitions and business initiatives are aligned with how people actually live in the present and how people imagine their futures with these automotive technologies. And this challenge just can't be solved simply by regulation, by consultation exercises, by surveys, or by co-design. The Swedish AHA Living Lab shows then that it requires qualitative social science investigation, theory, analysis, and interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder collaborations. In the Emerging Technologies Lab, we apply the same principle to many other technologies. We do collaborate with industry partners. We collaborate with the energy industry to understand the future of automation in residential energy demand. We collaborate with the City of Melbourne to bring human values into the design of future city data and sensor technologies. We investigate future automated mobilities through the Transport Mobilities focus area of the Australian Research Centre for Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society, and we research the place of automation and robotics in the future of work in a project funded by the Norwegian Research Council. Emerging technologies then, though, what they raise are interdisciplinary problems. And I believe that Australia needs a strategic interdisciplinary research agenda designed specifically to address this. There seem to me to be two key ingredients missing. First, co-leadership by social science experts and everyday technology users, and experts who can ensure that the interdisciplinary research actually moderates the ambitions of technologically driven agendas, and it helps us to ensure realistic, plausible, and ethical ways forward. Second, we need to combine the cutting edge of social science theory with the newest in engineering research. And in doing so, we need to create new insights about the technologies, about new technologies and possible futures that just aren't available at the moment. Now, in kind of making these calls, I'm not just calling on government and policy and industry to change their view of the social sciences, though. I've really often argued that we need a new extension of the social sciences to achieve this. Social science research is conventionally studied and learned from the past and the present. We now need a new interdisciplinary and public-facing social science, which puts futures at the centre of its agenda. We need to train a whole new generation of social scientists to work on futures with designers, with stakeholders, with engineers, with computer scientists, to actively engage in the future technology space. So to end, where new technologies are intended to intervene in everyday life situations, we need to engage with people in ways that are transparent and collaborative. Anthropologists and sociologists already know how to do this, and their expertise, along with the creation of new future-focused social science, I believe is essential to ensuring that Australian technology futures are ethical, equitable, and responsible. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, our last speaker in this session today is Professor Mark Griffin, who's Director of the Future of Work Institute at Curtin University in Western Australia. Mark's research examines the link between individual and organisational capability in areas such as safety, leadership, wellbeing, and productivity. Over to you, Mark.
Do that. Thanks very much for this opportunity and to follow up those really interesting and provocative presentations. To be provocative, I thought I would just say how optimistic I am about future technology changing the world of work. But to be less provocative, that's all going to depend on how well we integrate human experience into the future of work, not just sociology, anthropology, and labour economics, as we've heard already, but I'd also make a case for psychology, cognitive science, management science, organisational behaviour. In fact, the whole spectrum of social sciences and how we integrate that into the rapidly advancing technology is really probably a key issue that we address at the Future of Work Institute. I think all the talks highlight that work is changing, that automation and technology are key factors in that change, and the pandemic has not only accelerated that change, but made it a burning topic in just about everyone's mind, where now people do not talk just about what job do you have, but how do you go about doing your job? And that could really be changing at the moment in lots of ways. To focus on how I talk about this topic, I want to talk about remote operations. And I acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk people of Western Australia where we're located, and the Western Australian innovation around remote operations in our resource sector is really the foundation of a lot of our thinking of how technology is changing what's possible in the world of work. We see it at one level now in the Zoom conversations and conferences and online classes. I think at one level that's quite a superficial transformation of remote technology, and at a deeper level, a more fundamental level, we're seeing changes in healthcare, defence, manufacturing for a long time, emergency services. In fact, almost every industry fundamentally being changed by using aspects of what we might call remote operations. And in Western Australia, that often means a remote mine site, a remote facility being operated by a central control room. But that principle is really combines all the technologies that are really transforming work at the moment. So let me just say a little description of what remote operations might really be. It's the combination of faster and more complex communication networks using 5G and satellites. It's the technology that creates sensors, whether they're the watches on our hands or in the field, or drones watching telephone lines. It's robotics that are actually controlled by those systems and might do physical work that people used to do. And it's all the associated analytics, algorithms, AI or machine learning, or however you want to call it, those things being put together to change the way we can do things, how we do them and when we do them, to the point where we're saying a lot of work, as sadly we know, can be done anywhere, anytime. And that 24-hour, 7-day-a-week possibility is really a transformation that's probably been happening in many ways, but it's now almost a fundamental feature of the technology. So we have to think about perhaps differently of how we try to understand and manage within that changing context. So I emphasize it's quite a lot of technology in there, but the simple idea is that there's a node of people or machinery or robotics at one end connected by telecommunications networks to another node of people and machinery working, and increasingly algorithms are mediating some of that interaction. For us in this conversation here, all of that is happening right now. It's not doing much to the content or our responses. It's really just a medium for us to communicate. But more and more, the work might be feeding back information about what's happening at the other end. I might be, whether I'm teaching or managing a remote hospital service, that interaction is all being mediated by technology. And that's changing the way I work, we work. And the question for us as we work with industries in this area is, what does that mean for people? I mean, we take as given that people are fundamental to work, and we know, as Sarah pointed out, from all transformations, people have really behind the success, the use and the way things work. So how can we learn more about this evolving technical environment across all sectors: education, health, defence, resources, emergency service, policing? All of those are changing the way they work through these kind of operations. To focus that discussion, I look at two implications, and coincidentally in the last week, two big reports have come out with quite different implications about this changing world of work. One of which we've been involved in is by the group AROSE, which is the Australian Remote Operations Space and Earth venture and cooperation between universities and industry, looking at the potential for remote operations to change an industry, how people work, and be a transformational opportunity for Australia's competitiveness in evolving economies. Very forward-looking, optimistic report. And just yesterday, the ACTU report on the changing world of work and how that is creating new demands, less security, more fatigue, more, you name it, more stresses for everyone. Again, I don't have to convince people here that a lot of us are not experiencing more demands in work at the moment. Those two different kind of foci represent two aspects of this technological change that's happening. One I put under the heading of the network connections, and I think John mentioned right early on, the transformations happen a bit faster than we can keep up with in human terms, and the ability for technology to connect people at the moment seems way above our cognitive capacity to manage those connections or work socially in those connections. So there's much to learn about how we work in a network, a highly networked, evolving, computerized network of communication. What are our cognitive limitations there? What are our social implications? We know there's been a long-term move from more vertical structures of management and control to more horizontal ones. The role of networks and data has huge potential to just flatten structures in a way that we're not able to manage in traditional organizational forms. So the interaction across networks between people, between human and machines, creates a huge need to understand what is the human role, how are needs fulfilled in that context, what are our capabilities as people, as social units, all open to research and working together. So that network aspect is really important to understand. The other highlighted by the ACTU is the health and well-being. What does it mean to be in a world where potentially we can work 24 hours a day in any location? How do we manage that? Is it through regulation? Is it through controls? Or do we need a much more radically different way of understanding the cycles of fatigue, rest, sleep, recovery, holidays, family cycles, the systems I think Marion was really talking about over a lifespan are broken down by this level of integration across technology. We have to actively manage that process because our physiological states really cannot work that way. We know that. So the question becomes, how do we manage health and well-being in such an interconnected world of work? And I'm focusing very much on the work and the possibilities in those industries I've mentioned, which all can benefit greatly from that kind of integration, but the human needs, values, and roles need much, much stronger understanding, a new understanding of those capacities. How's that going to happen? I think everyone's pointed toward a role of social science and the whole spectrum of social science being much better integrated with the STEM, engineering, computer science, medical sciences, brain sciences as well, all have a role to play in understanding the human condition in this more networked world of work and automated world of work. We talked about co-design and collaboration, interdisciplinary. They're all really important. I would just maybe add somewhat a blurring of the boundaries between, say, engineering and social science. How do we actually integrate some of those disciplines when we're solving problems and working? I think that's an area we'd like to be working more on in our institute, of being a part of ongoing endeavors in the STEM side, the STEM areas, whether it's computer science. And an example to finish up with, and I think we're a bit over time, I'm sorry, Sarah, is that we work a lot in changing industry with the maintainers of those industries. Traditionally, a very manual role and quite a identifying role with people who work in that. The role of maintainers across all kinds of industries that we work is really being transformed, and by the use of data, by the use of automation, by being able to work remotely in all of these industries. Yet we haven't got a good understanding of how we do maintain all the systems we're creating, what that workforce will look like, how they will be trained, how they will be attracted into the kind of different professions they are, or move people around. So a really practical site for understanding this for us over the last few years has been the role of the maintainer in future work and future technological change. Thanks for giving me that time for a quick overview of what we're struggling with here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark. So yeah, we've had a really good session of 4 very different speakers, and I think it's a good example of the diversity across the social sciences just within one topic. And there's lots of really, really important questions that have been raised. Now, for the audience, if you've got questions for the speakers, can you please put it in the Q&A chat box and I will ask the speakers. But I'll start off with a question. I think I'll go to Marion with this one. So when we're talking about issues to do with remote work, flexibility, working from home, etc., I think for females, like the question I know is, for some extent, the opportunity to work flexibility can keep females actually in the workplace rather than having to make the choice, no, you know, I want to care for my children or other families, etc. But then it raises the question of, does the glass ceiling change in terms of, you know, because if females, for example, are more likely to make the choice, I want to work remotely, and then they lose out on the networking opportunities or being the benefits of being face-to-face, you know, the question's been raised that do women end up being more disadvantaged in the long term? So would you like to kind of take that question on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. It's really the question that we were asked a lot during COVID. It's a good question. And when COVID began in 2020, there was huge excitement and a number of journalists ringing to say, oh, this is the beginning of the transformation in gender roles because men are staying at home and looking after the children as well. And indeed, in that first few weeks in Sydney, I'm not quite sure about the rest of the state, there were it was beautiful weather, which I think made a difference. There were lots of parents, mums and dads, outside with their kids during the day doing those extra activities. Second time round, it didn't work like that. With the second long lockdown in Sydney, we saw women staying at home more than men. Interestingly, the social science research showed that men's stress levels went up more than men's went up more than women's, partly because they were starting to cope with this new environment. We think women's were mediated a bit by the fact they weren't commuting, something that John had mentioned. But one of the big issues is what happens to their careers when they step back from the labour market, either altogether or in terms of presence in the workplace. And pre-pandemic research shows that if you're not there and you're not present, it will affect your careers and your attachment and to the labour market and your ability to get given the choice positions, the promotions, the training opportunities, whatever it is. I think this raises 2 questions. It's not just a question about what impact does it have on women. It raises a huge question about how do Australian managers manage. And we've needed for a long time to have another, dare I say, inquiry or review of management practices, because it puts enormous stress on managers to manage a remote workforce and a workforce in the office. And with lean organisations and not much resourcing, I can see it quite easily happen that women sort of return to the home to do their work. They'll opt for that. Those who have the opportunity, and we're talking about a very divided labour market here, but managers also overlooking what they're doing at home or not giving them the same opportunities. So it's a bit of a call to arms for both the women who are working from home to remember they have to keep on being present in meetings, speak up on Zoom, do all those practical things, but for our management practices to also change and also be given a boost and assistance in managing these, what we're beginning to call hybrid workplaces.
Yeah.
As they are in hybrid teaching, with dealing with the student in the classroom face-to-face and the one on Zoom is different.
Definitely. John, question from Professor Jane Hall. Can you talk us through how we measure productivity and perhaps some of the problems with it and how it could be
Sure.
changed?
Well, and they're large, because really, for the goods economy, we basically assume that the price of the good is the product, and we can do hedonic adjustments and things like that to say, yeah, this year's computer is 10% better than last year's computer, and so forth. And we look at what goes into it, and we look at what value is added at each stage, and that's measured by market transactions. So that doesn't work well for lots of services. Really, for health services, for example, I mean, this is a typical example, but also education. We just say output equals input is how it's measured. So we don't, whether a hospital cures people or not, doesn't appear at all in its productivity. And the only way to fix that is by direct measurement of stuff that isn't measured by market transactions, which invariably is going to be fairly thoroughly ad hoc. That is, you're going to need a different technique in each part of the economy. So Steve Garrick and I, former member of the Academy, passed on. We looked at life expectancy as a proxy for the output of the health sector of the economy, including a whole bunch of other things. And you can do that and get some interesting results. But of course, then you need something different for education, where putting a lot more of the young population through all forms of education. Are they getting as well educated as they were 30 years ago, when the resources were certainly a lot larger? If you look at the Australian universities' ratios, particularly of academic staff to students, they've gone down drastically. That doesn't show up as an increase in productivity because there's no output measure. If indeed the people we're graduating now are as good as the ones we graduated 30 years ago, then the university education sector has had a massive impact on productivity. That's incredibly hard to measure, and it's even harder, and I think past the point of not really being possible with information. So a while ago, there was a calculation that enough new information was being generated every 2 days. In terms of bits and bytes, as all the books that have been published up to 1900, they would now be like every 2 seconds, perhaps. Most of it cat videos and stuff like that. And so trying to work out what's going on, trying to work out whether we can even use concepts like productivity in the way we've been accustomed to, I think is highly problematic. And that in turn, I think, coming back to what Marion had to say, creates questions as to whether the kinds of organisations we've been used to have a sustainable future in their current form. That is, if all the work, supposing that not only women but men decide to stay home and do their stuff, and that works well, what does that imply for the existence of a corporation and managers and so forth? It's not at all obvious what kind of form of economic organisation, not quite that the corporate and large organisations we have are the right way to manage that. But it's also not clear. It doesn't seem as though small independent contractors are going to be the way to go either. So I think we are really right at the beginning trying to work out what this information economy in particular and service economy is going to look like and how it's going to organise itself. And we're, for the moment, carrying on with forms of organisation which will develop for a very different set of technologies, which I guess is the kind of thing that Sarah had something to say about also.
Thank you, John. We had a question for Mark. Mark, you mentioned a couple of reports. Where can you get them from? Some people want to know.
I saw that, and I've just put in the chat the Arose website link, and the title of the ACTU report is Work Shouldn't Hurt survey. So the website and that title should get you to those reports, and it's in the chat there.
Good, thank you. Okay, Sarah, I've got a question I think you can give us some response on. So someone's talked about considering the potential for emerging technologies to make our lives and work more productive. Could and should this result in a reduction in the hours we spend engaged in productive work? Does it also make it easier for us to balance social reproduction and work? And Marion, you might want to come in with the response after Sarah.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing, I'm not sure if emerging technologies will make our work more productive. I think it would depend very much on the way in which people are actually using emerging technologies in the workplace, in terms of if we can actually shape emerging technologies in our workplaces so that they can assist us to be more productive. So that's one aspect of it. But I think that there are kind of various other issues around emerging technologies in the workplace. I mean, one of them is in relation to will there be less work for us to do? Well, maybe there won't be, because there's also the question of actually training people to use emerging technologies. So there's one level of the kind of emerging technologies that might assist us in the workplace. For example, workplace AI, which might do bits of our jobs for us or organise things for us. But on the other hand, for example, look at the construction industry and the idea of introducing robotisation and automated technologies there. Many of those technologies are going to be operated or used or work with human workers, or might be remotely operated from other sites. So look, what we see happening is actually, and also, for example, in the construction industry, there aren't enough workers at the moment anywhere. There's a real shortage of skilled people. So in some of those contexts, emerging technologies won't be taking people's jobs away or even reducing the amount of work people have to do. But they're also kind of in a context where new jobs are going to be created around those technologies. The tech just doesn't come in and take the work away from us. There will be new ways of working, which will involve people and technologies working together, but also potentially different categories of person will be working with the technology. So there might be opportunities for more women to work in industries which have typically been masculine dominated. There might be more opportunities for men to work in industries that women have dominated as well. So there are some really positive, potentially positive elements here, but it's going to very much depend on how that's managed. And I'm sure that Marion will have something to say about that.
We're getting the hurry up, so we're going to have a few more minutes.
I'll keep this really quick. I mean, Sarah said exactly right there. There will be new jobs, different jobs. Industry will change. Most of the reports are now recognising we're not going to face a huge loss of jobs, but we will find new jobs. Then we have to work out how we get people into those jobs and train them for those jobs, etc. But I want to say the one concrete thing that we're already seeing, and John's alluded to it, is the issue of working hours. And I think technology really disrupts our concept of what is a working day. It's already happened, but working from home, working all hours, that's fine, but we don't have the regulatory space. We don't have the policy set up to work out how you pay for that. Do we have a concept of overtime anymore? What constitutes a day's work? How do we reward that? I think these are really tangible problems that we have to deal with immediately, and they're the future is today. It is now, and these are the issues we're having to face. I'll leave it at that, but I think the working hours one is one of the most critical ones at the moment.
John, you wanted to have a
it's a striking feature with the kind of periodisation put forward that the goods economy saw this long decline in working hours after the initial intensification. Of course, at the beginning, an incredible intensification because people could work under a roof, under lighting if necessary, as long as they could stand it. And that was edged away over 100 years down to something like a 38-hour week, a 48-week year, and so forth, maybe 40 years ago. And it not only hasn't changed since then, of course, there've been although this has gone ebbed and flowed, probably the peak of intensification was in the 90s, but we haven't seen those shifts. And yet it certainly seems as though, depending on how the remote work economy plays out, workers are going to have a great deal more autonomy and potentially will move back to the kind of working structures that we had in cottage industries and so forth. On the other hand, we might see intensified supervision and so forth, or we might see a two-part workforce, as I think a core group turning up at the office 5 days a week and running the show, and another group outwards. All these things, I think, not only regulation, but of course, old-fashioned as it is, class struggle is going to play a major role in determining these kind of outcomes.
Thank you. All right, we have to call it quits there. I know we could keep talking about this all day, but we don't have time and we want to have a bit of a lunch break. So thank you to all our 4 wonderful speakers for this session. We are on a lunch break now, but at 12:30 we'll rejoin AED tea time. The next session will be a roundtable on improving the status and reception of the social sciences. So please rejoin with the same link, and thank you all.